Hey guys, and welcome to the fifth installment of readings from Gift of the Shaper. I'm your host, DL Jennings. Thanks for joining us. So if you haven't seen the previous four readings, basically just search YouTube for DL Jennings. You can click on playlist, and under that, I've got the other four kind of set up in a playlist. So all you have to do is hit play, and it'll take you through it. You know, if you're on like a long car ride, or if you're looking to be rocked to sleep by my voice, just go ahead and click on it, and hopefully that will, solve your problems, solve all your problems. So this is chapter 5, and this takes place in Highglade. The horses' hooves beat against the dirt road as they rode toward the village. There was urgency in Kethras's voice when he told them they must hurry, and Thornton took him for the type that did not exaggerate. The horses were running at a comfortable pace, but no less impressive to Thornton was that the Kinari were keeping up with them. Their big legs took long and graceful strides, rebounding off the ground with ease, and making Thornton wonder if he was even seeing them at their fastest. Suddenly he understood why neither one of them had brought a horse of their own. They slowed as they rounded a curve in the road, and Thornton could see his home through the trees. The dirt road meandered into offshoots of smaller roads, eventually making its way to one of the smaller number of houses in the village, houses that Thornton knew well, along with the names of everyone who lived in them. He'd spent his entire life here among these trees, climbing, playing in the dirt, laughing, growing. He breathed in, letting the familiar smells fill his nostrils. Grass, dust, animals, trees. He didn't want to leave any of it behind. They came to a stop with Kethras in front, breathing more heavily than normal, but not nearly hard enough to suggest he'd been running stride for stride with a horse. Thornton swung his legs off the side of Jericho and hopped off. "Say what you have to say," said Inara. "We will stay here." Thornton nodded and took off toward the house. He saw the telltale smoke rising from his father's forge. Another late night using just the moonlight as his lamp. As he got closer, though, something seemed wrong. He quickened his pace when he realized the smoke wasn't coming from the forge. It was coming from the house. He raced to the door and flung it open, yelling for his father. "Father!" he screamed. No answer. He yelled again. "Father!" Urgency and panic lined his voice. When his shout was met with silence, he turned back to his three companions, a look of wild desperation in his eyes, and shouted for Mira. She was on her feet and running before he finished her name. The Kinari both looked at each other and then back at Thornton, who was already making his way inside the house. He burst inside, still shouting for his father. The smoke was not so thick yet that it was impenetrable, but looking upstairs he realized it was about to get much worse. A gray haze hung in the house as Thornton covered his mouth with his hand. He scanned the floor for the source of the smoke but saw nothing. His eyes went back to the stairs that led to the single room he shared with his father. He was up them in a heartbeat, taking the stairs 3 at a time. As he reached the top, he headed toward the room, unsure if he wanted to find his father there, and what it would mean if he did. He did not need to open the door. It was hanging off its hinges already, having been forced open from the outside. He stared wide-eyed as the flames leapt from the bed, engulfing it almost entirely, and began to spread to the walls. Their bedside table had been overturned, and the lamp they used at night was smashed to pieces. There were 2 holes in the back wall, roughly human-sized, and Thornton immediately knew that his father had put up a fight. Olsen Woods never did anything easily. So I am what's called a discovery writer. If you've heard the term, it's probably because of Stephen King. He was the one who really popularized it. And it's basically the kind of writer who pretty much makes things up as they go along. And it's opposed to the kind of structured, outline writer who has every single detail, plot, already written out, already thought ahead. They write it all down, and it's a very rigid, very organized structure. Well, that's not me. I don't do that. So when I was writing, this was actually kind of the first twist, I guess, that I wrote into it. When Thornton comes back and he sees the smoke from his father's forge, or what he thinks is the smoke from his father's forge, I got this kind of voice in the back of my head going, what if we threw something in here? What if we put in a twist here? Like maybe his father was taken. So obviously I had to go back and rewrite the first chapter, and kind of plant that seed like, hey, we've got a job for you, that, Decane, who was saying to his hired henchman. But this surprised me. So hopefully, I kind of give it away on the jacket of the book, but, this was actually a surprise to me when I first wrote this. So the flames were now spreading to the ceiling, and Thornton knew he didn't have long. Seeing no signs of his father but plenty of a struggle, he backed out of the room and onto the stairs. Smoke stung his eyes as he coughed and made his way back onto the ground floor where Mira was waiting. Inara and Kethris stood behind her. "My father, he's gone," Mira interrupted. Thornton nodded and rubbed his smoke-stung eyes. "We should not have come," Kethris said to Inara, almost out of earshot, as she raised her nose to the air as if suddenly catching a scent, slipping quietly out the door. "No!" Thornton shouted and turned back to look at the Qunari. "Whoever did this got here before we did. There's no way they followed us." His voice quieted. They knew what they were looking for. Thinking of the strange man who had asked about his father, who seemed so consumed with his hammer, he added, "This is my fault." Mira slapped him across the face, hard, and pointed a finger right at him. "Stop it right now, Thornton Woods. This is most certainly not your fault. And if Olson were here, he would tell you the same, but with a much firmer hand. This is no one's fault but the people who did it. And I most certainly want to find out who that is." Thornton rubbed his face, shaking his head to rid it of the shock. "But how?" He looked past Mira at Kethris. "Is there some way of finding out who did this? Of tracking them?" The tall Qunari looked up at the gathering smoke and said calmly, "Perhaps we should move outside," and stepped backward through the open doorway, standing just beyond the threshold. Inara was walking back toward them, a look of determination on her dark face. "The tracks lead north," she started. "But whoever did this took precautions, above the skill of even the greatest hunter." She paused before speaking again. "Whoever took your father used breaking to try to cover their tracks." Thornton's eyes darkened as he heard the word. He'd only just found out what it meant, and he remembered the fear that coursed through him when he stood face to face with a kith. Now that fear had been replaced by hate. "We can track them," Kethris said, "but we must be cautious. Meet us at the north side of the village. Inara and I will find the trail." By now the flames had fully engulfed the upper part of Thornton's house. He stood numbly as he watched his boyhood home turn to ash and dust in front of him. The commotion had drawn the rest of the village out, with most of them dressed for sleep. But the calm manner in which Thornton stared at the flames, the oranges and reds dancing off his eyes, made them hesitate to approach him. He simply stood and stared while they worked around him to douse the fire. The Qunari had slipped away unnoticed yet again, which came as no surprise. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, then back to Mira. "I have to find him," he said, his voice calm against the flames. "I'll come with you," Mira said. Her words were quiet, yet firm. Thornton looked up and studied her face. "Mira, no, you can't. Your home—" She cut him off before he could finish. "Hasn't been a home since Father died. There's nothing left for me here. All I've had to look forward to are my trips to Lusk, and now even that's ruined." She looked despondently at Thornton's house, flames licking at the night sky. "Now there's nothing left." Thornton's eyes followed hers. "Then I guess we've got no reason to stay." He turned his back on his house and walked over to Jericho, who stomped a foot and shook his head. Thornton took his reins and started toward the north of the village, Mira and Matilda following closely behind. The journey north took them through the Talvin forest, a densely wooded area that stretched on and on for miles. To the Qunari, it was comforting to be surrounded by forest. They were children of nature and were one with it. They seemed relaxed, almost cheerful. To Thornton, it was not as relaxing. The only time he liked to be outside was when he was helping his father with his work, and it was starting to get to him. He was fighting off fatigue and exhaustion, swatting at the swarming mosquitoes, which Inara found entertaining, and complaining of soreness for riding for so long. So walk, Kethris had said before catching a scent and disappearing into the forest, dagger already unsheathed. He'd been dipping into the forest at random intervals and had already caught enough for a small meal for each of them. By now, Thornton thought he was just showing off. The road wound through the woods and occasionally split off in different directions, but the Kinari had no problem keeping them on the trail despite the darkness. Thornton wasn't sure how he did it, but whenever they came to a fork in the road, Kethris would survey the area for a moment or two before announcing which path they must follow. As the night dragged on, the events of the day began to take their toll on Thornton. He was bruised, bloody, and drained, and the combined weight of those factors had finally started to catch up with him. He'd only meant to shut his eyes for a moment, but his body seemed to have other plans. His head lolled back and his torso wavered. Mira let out a cry as she watched him tumble from his saddle and crash to the ground. His childhood friend was at his side in an instant. "Are you all right?" she asked as she helped him sit up. "What happened?" I don't know," he answered slowly while rubbing his head. "Just careless, I guess." He got up with Mira's help and started to walk back to Jericho. "Thornton, no," Mira said, still holding onto his arm. "You're hurt. You need rest." "I'll be fine. I'm just tired, that's all." He tried to pull his arm away, but Mira wouldn't budge. Kethris looked at Thornton, who was barely able to stand on his own. "She is right," he said. "You are in no condition to go much further." Mira looked at the two Kinari. "What if we just stop for a little while?" she asked. "Just to get some rest. Could we pick up the trail again in a few hours?" "I suppose we can," Inara said. "We have covered a good amount of ground and the tracks are still fresh. But we cannot stop for long if we have any hope of catching up." She looked at Thornton's arm that had been opened by the sword of the men they'd fought. She'd done a good job of bandaging it with what she had. "We should look around for a place to rest, and I would like to look at your arm some more. Come." Thornton was too tired to argue. He grabbed Jericho's reins and followed the Kinari as she led the way. Up ahead they crossed over a small stream, and Kethris produced a pouch, which he proceeded to dip into the water. Thornton watched his long body, sleek and dark, as it worked so gracefully at even the simplest task. It reminded him of the foxes that would sometimes make their way into Highglade in hopes of finding a chicken coop left open at night. When the pouch was full, the Kinari tied it to his belt, cupped his hands together, and drank straight from the stream. Between drinks, he suggested the others do the same. Mira led Maddie to the water from which the old mare happily drank. Jericho didn't need any help getting to the stream and almost took off Thornton's arm trying to get there. The two horses drank deeply beside the Kinari as Thornton looked on. Standing up and wiping his mouth, Kethris went to look around for a place to stop for the night, fading into the trees as silently as ever. Inara took out a pouch of her own and dipped it into the stream, tying it off and turning to Thornton. Tapping her finger on the pouch, she said, "I will have to teach you how to make one of these." She hooked it to her belt and patted it. "Useful on travels such as these." Thornton gave a sleepy smile and a nod, wishing he could get back indoors again. "There's a small clearing up ahead," Kethris said, suddenly standing behind Thornton, who nearly leapt out of his skin in surprise. Mira pointed and laughed, while neither of the Kinari seemed to understand the joke. Thornton regained his composure quickly, though. "Fine, show us where so we can get some rest." Kethris led them off the path into an open part of the woods, close enough to see or hear anyone coming by, but well concealed enough so as not to give away their position. Seizing the opportunity, Inara made Thornton sit down while she unwrapped his bandage, washed off the blood, and rewrapped the arm. "There," she said. "That looks better already." Thornton groggily nodded his thanks. Beside him, Kethris pulled 6 squirrels out of another pouch he was carrying and asked Mira if she knew how to skin an animal. When she stared wordlessly at him, he took the opportunity to demonstrate proper skinning technique to both her and Thornton. So I actually took this kind of scene from my experience in SEER, which is Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, and it's something that aircrew military guys like me have to go through when we're getting training. So this I actually took directly, not directly, we didn't have any Kinari with us, but I had to skin a rabbit. I had to take out the guts and, pop out the eyeball and stuff like that. And it was my first time ever doing that. I grew up in, Ohio, Cleveland, so not really a lot of opportunities to get lost in the woods. So this was very much based heavily on my own actual experience. The Kinari took 2 squirrels and hung them up with a small piece of twine, cutting them cleanly down the middle and spreading the skin to reveal the insides. Thornton did not fare well with the whole process. It's me. And Mira mostly stared in wide-eyed horror that ranged from disgust to fascination. "All of this we throw out," Kethris said as he held up the liver, emptying out the insides. "The rest we keep." Thornton could not figure out why he was smiling and was unsure that he wanted to ask. Kethris used his knife to delicately cut away skin from muscle, and then looked to Thornton. "Here," the tall Kinari said. "You try." Begrudgingly, Thornton approached the animal and put his hands on the squirrel, surprised by how warm it was. Inara pointed and began to talk him through the process. Trying to nod like he was listening, he had made no more than 2 errant cuts when he looked up to see Mira was already moving on to her second squirrel. He looked at the Kinari for help. Kethris made an amused grunt and approached Thornton to finish the job himself. As he did so, Inara pointed out how the skins could be used to carry things and that skinning techniques applied to larger animals as well. After skinning the animal, Kethris had Inara fetch some wood for a fire and offered another squirrel to Mira. She took it with enthusiasm and eyed the remaining ones. By the time Inara had gathered enough for a small cook fire, Mira had finished the job and seemed pleased with herself, if not a little relieved to be done with it. The look in her eyes told Thornton that he would be hearing about it for a while. Inara then sharpened the ends of a couple of sticks to make skewers, while Kethris showed Thornton how to start a fire using just 2 pieces of wood and some twine. But as the flames took hold, Thornton was suddenly reminded of the eyes of the kith, those haunting, glowing orbs that seemed to float inside cracked and blackened skin. He turned to Mira with a worried look on his face. As if reading his thoughts, Mira sat down beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're worried about him, but the fact that there are tracks at all means that they want your father alive." Thornton rubbed a hand on his forehead as he grimaced. "But why did they take him in the first place? Why him? Why us?" His upturned palms hung in the air along with his questions. "I don't know the answers," Mira said as she leaned in, "but I hope the Kinari might. If their mother knew enough to send them to help us, then maybe she knows a lot more." Thornton looked at her with pleading eyes. He had always had his father around, a fact that he knew better than to voice at the moment. Before he could speak, though, he caught a glimpse of a figure behind him. Turning, he saw Kethris flash his sharp teeth as he held up 2 roasted squirrels. "You fought bravely today," said the Kinari. "It has been long since anyone has stood victorious in battle against 1 kith, let alone 3. He passed the squirrel meat to Mira and Thornton. "And the way that you fought tells me you will do whatever it takes to find your father." Thornton acknowledged this with a nod. "And we will do everything we can to help," said Inara. "But for now, you must take care of your hunger and your minds." Thornton and Mira both nodded at this as they watched Kethris skewer 2 more squirrels and hold them over the fire. Before long, they had full stomachs and heavy eyelids. "Get what sleep you can," Kethris said as they had all finished eating. "We cannot stay for long." Taking the blankets off the horses, Thornton knelt to place them on the ground, leaning over them and smoothing them out with his hands. When he had finished, he looked up at Mira. "Thank you for doing this," he said. The look on her face told him that he was a fool for thanking her, but that she cared for him more than anyone living. "Olsen has been more of a father to me than mine ever was. You know I wouldn't have let you run off by yourself." "I know, but I thought I should say something." She walked over to him and took his head in her hands, kissed him lightly on the forehead, and smiled. "Then say it to Olsen when we find him again." Thornton watched her as she walked away to wrap herself up in one of the thick wool blankets they'd brought, a few feet away from where Matilda was tied. Looking to find his own blanket, he watched Kethris grab a branch from a nearby tree to hoist himself up, lying down on his stomach with his hands folded under his chin. He pulled up the cloth hanging around his neck and covered his eyes with it. Inara did the same thing on another tree nearby. Thornton shook his head in wonder and walked over near Jericho to lie down. It was warm enough to sleep on top of the blanket, which provided just enough padding to make him comfortable. Exhaustion wrestled with his fear and his uncertainty over finding his father again, and what more they would have to do to get him back safely. But soon his exhaustion emerged as the victor, giving way to slumber and the darkness of dreams. So there we go. That's chapter 5. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And like I said, if you want to check out the other 4 chapters, if you haven't already, go ahead and just click on the playlists here. And if you haven't picked up Gift of the Shaper, you can pick it up on Amazon. It is the first result now when you type it in. So just Gift of the Shaper by D.L. Jennings. And if you have any suggestions for, the format of this, if there's anything that you want to hear, if you got any questions for me that I kind of haven't already addressed, feel free to leave them in the comments. And we'll see you guys next time.